There are photographs that were never meant to be seen, images so disturbing that seasoned doctors debated whether showing them violated basic human dignity. In a remote corner of Appalachia in 1971, a young man gave birth to something that defied science, faith, and morality. His name was Samuel Whitaker. And when the doctors first saw what emerged from his body, 3 of them walked out of the delivery room. One never practiced medicine again. The child born that October morning wasn't simply the result of incest. It was the end point of a bloodline so corrupted, so tangled, that geneticists would later call it impossible. And yet, the medical records exist. The photographs exist. The child existed for 6 days. When officials demanded to know who the father was, every adult male in Samuel's family stepped forward. His father, his uncle, his grandfather, even his brother. Each claimed responsibility, not from guilt, but from pride. They were protecting something they called the pure line, a tradition passed down through generations of men who believed their blood was sacred and that outsiders were corruption itself. If you're still here, you're already braver than most. This story will take you into places where medicine, morality, and human nature itself collapse. If you want more forgotten histories like this one, hit like, share it with someone who dares to listen, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Trust me, this is only the beginning. The Whitaker story begins in 1847, when Joshua Whitaker, a stern and solitary frontiersman, claimed 200 acres of land in the unforgiving Appalachian Mountains. He wasn't seeking prosperity, he was seeking absolute isolation from outsiders. The soil was rocky, the winters brutal, and the nearest town 3 days' travel across treacherous ground. Yet Joshua thrived in the wilderness. He built his homestead by hand, raising walls that promised privacy and permanence. Joshua believed separation from society was strength. He distrusted townsmen, merchants, and preachers alike, convinced that the outside world carried corruption. His creed was simple: bloodline above all, and only through men could it remain pure. Unlike settlers who sought trade or marriage ties, Joshua refused all such connections. He brought with him his younger brother Elijah and his cousin Nathaniel, both sworn to uphold the same code of blood and silence. Together, the 3 men built not only homes, but a doctrine. They agreed that their descendants would never intermingle with outsiders. The Whitaker name would remain untouched, protected by the hands of brothers, fathers, and uncles. Neighbors whispered about Joshua's unusual severity, but few dared approach. The mountains themselves became a barrier, their mist-shrouded ridges concealing a family bound by secrecy. What began as isolation slowly hardened into something darker, almost ritualistic. By the 1850s, Joshua had fathered many sons, all under his doctrine. Outsiders offered daughters for alliances, but Joshua refused them with cold finality. His sons would never marry strangers. Only men of Whitaker blood mattered. The children were raised not to see cousins as distant kin, but as brothers in arms. Fathers taught sons, uncles guided nephews, and grandfathers passed down lessons. Masculinity became sacred, the Whitaker bloodline an altar they worshipped. By the next generation, the Whitakers weren't just a family. They were a closed society. Outsiders called them strange, even cursed, but within those cabins, discipline and loyalty to bloodline were considered the highest virtue. One by one, Whitaker sons inherited land, dividing and expanding across the ridges. They farmed together, hunted together, and enforced silence against prying questions. Every man carried the same belief: purity was strength, and outsiders meant ruin. Their journals, discovered decades later, revealed troubling patterns. Joshua's handwriting recorded in detail his conviction that only Whitaker men could carry the divine spark. To share blood with outsiders, he wrote, would destroy generations of effort. Elijah reinforced the doctrine with military rigidity. He designed schedules of labor, enforced rituals before meals, and ensured each son memorized genealogies like scripture. Nathaniel, the cousin, acted as record keeper, preserving every birth, every union, every oath. These early Whitakers weren't simple farmers. They saw themselves as custodians of a grand experiment. Each generation, they believed, would refine the bloodline further, distilling something stronger, something purer, something outsiders could never understand. By the 1880s, the Whitaker homestead had become more fortress than farm. Stone walls rose higher, windows narrowed, and every path was guarded by watchful brothers. Visitors rarely returned. Men who asked questions often disappeared. Yet inside those fortified cabins, Whitaker boys grew strong. They were trained to hunt with silence, to fight without hesitation, and to recite their lineage backward for 7 generations. Knowledge of blood was considered more vital than scripture. Their bodies were marked by the mountain life, but also by something stranger. Neighbors whispered about Whitaker sons who didn't speak, who stared too long, or whose eyes seemed too pale for their years. Still, Joshua's descendants doubled down on the code. To them, these oddities weren't curses. They were signs of chosen blood. The Whitakers believed their pure line was approaching something outsiders weren't meant to witness. And so, by the dawn of the 20th century, the Whitakers had sealed themselves off entirely. No outsider could breach their circle. What began with Joshua's oath had become a dynasty, bound by secrecy, ruled by men. The doctrine of purity took root during the 2nd generation of Whitaker men. Joshua's sons, raised on isolation and strict blood loyalty, expanded their father's creed into a philosophy that governed every moment of their lives. Samuel, Joshua's eldest son, carved the doctrine into wooden tablets displayed above every hearth. He wrote that Whitaker men carried a divine flame in their veins, one that could never be diluted by outsiders. His brothers, Daniel and Isaac, enforced this belief like law. They taught their own sons that marrying or mixing with strangers was a betrayal of blood itself. To them, honor meant preserving the Whitaker spark. Grandfathers gathered sons and grandsons around firelit tables, reciting genealogies like scripture. They spoke of lineage as though it were holy text, repeating names of forefathers until boys memorized them deeper than prayers. The doctrine outlawed softness. Brothers were commanded to harden themselves, reject outside ideas, and treat bloodline above wealth, faith, or fortune. A Whitaker's duty wasn't to thrive in society, but to perfect his blood. As the creed grew, so did the rituals. Before meals, each man placed his hand on his chest and swore loyalty to the line. No oath was greater than fidelity to Whitaker blood. Uncles oversaw trials of strength and discipline, pushing nephews to exhaustion in hunting, farming, and combat drills. A Whitaker boy who faltered was reminded that weakness endangered not only himself, but generations unborn. By the 1890s, whispers spread across the mountains about strange gatherings deep in the hollers. Travelers spoke of hearing chants in low, masculine voices, echoes carrying across valleys like prayers twisted into warnings. Inside those circles, fathers stood with sons, chanting passages from Samuel's tablets. They declared that Whitaker men were chosen to achieve perfection, a purity of blood that no preacher or king could rival. Doctors who visited the ridges began noticing unsettling patterns. Whitaker boys bore uncanny resemblances across generations. Their faces seemed carved from the same mold, their features repeating, as though the bloodline itself resisted change. Outsiders called it unnatural. Inside, it was celebrated. Brothers admired the similarities, claiming the likeness proved their doctrine worked. They saw no deformity, only confirmation that Whitaker blood was untainted, unwavering, eternal. By the turn of the century, Whitaker journals revealed a chilling precision. Lineages were mapped like blueprints, each union carefully arranged. Fathers paired sons with cousins, uncles dictated unions, and grandfathers oversaw every decision. This control wasn't driven by lust, but by obsession with pattern. They believed every choice tightened the circle, inching closer to what they called the perfect line. Straying outside would shatter generations of effort. Discipline grew harsher. A Whitaker man who questioned the doctrine faced punishment from brothers and uncles alike. To reject purity was to betray the clan, a crime more unforgivable than theft or murder. Skeptics within the mountains whispered that the Whitakers were building something more dangerous than superstition. They said these men weren't just keeping to themselves, they were conducting an experiment hidden from civilization. And perhaps they were right. Each decade, the doctrine deepened, binding sons tighter to fathers, nephews tighter to uncles, grandsons tighter to grandfathers. The circle narrowed, the creed strengthened, the Whitaker men more convinced than ever. By the early 1900s, the doctrine had consumed them entirely. It was no longer a rule, but a destiny. The Whitaker men believed their blood was evolving towards something greater, and nothing would stop it. The mountains kept their secret. Outsiders feared the shadows of those ridges, while inside, the Whitakers sharpened their creed into a weapon of blood, purity, and legacy, guarded by men alone. By the early 20th century, the Whitaker men had refined their doctrine into something more than tradition. It became a system, precise and cold, where every union was scheduled and every birth carefully documented. Grandfathers oversaw the records, writing with meticulous precision in thick ledgers. They tracked which sons joined with which cousins, ensuring the bloodline followed strict patterns. It was less family than experiment, orchestrated by patriarchs. Brothers who questioned the order were silenced quickly. Uncles enforced rules with fists and axes, reminding everyone that hesitation weakened the circle. To resist was not merely disobedience, it was betrayal of Whitaker blood. The rotation system dictated that no single man could dominate lineage. Instead, each cousin and uncle contributed in sequence, creating overlapping generations. To outsiders, it seemed perverse. To Whitakers, it was mathematical perfection. Fathers raised sons without clear definitions of kinship. One man could be both father and brother to the same boy. Bloodlines folded back upon themselves until distinctions lost meaning, replaced by a singular identity: Whitaker. Doctors who examined the few Whitaker boys brought to towns for emergencies noticed anomalies. Features repeated strangely, jawlines doubled, eyes unusually light. Yet the men who brought them showed pride rather than shame. They boasted that these marks proved success, evidence of perfection emerging. The outside world saw deformity. Whitaker men saw destiny. They believed each generation was closer to revealing the culmination of their design. The rotation system demanded ritual. Before each union, brothers gathered in torchlight, swearing oaths to the bloodline. These oaths were carved into stone tablets, hidden in mountain caves known only to Whitaker men. Some outsiders tried to investigate. Traveling ministers, county officers, even wandering journalists attempted to question the family. None returned with useful answers. The Whitaker men simply smiled, silent and unyielding, guarding their doctrine like soldiers. Inside, discipline grew severe. Sons were punished for disobedience with days of isolation, denied food until they recited the doctrine word for word. Uncles ensured boys memorized not only names, but precise sequences of lineage. The rotation system gave power to the elders. Grandfathers assigned unions, uncles enforced them, brothers carried them out. No man acted alone. Each decision was collective, reinforcing loyalty while binding every Whitaker to the circle. By the 1920s, this system had produced several generations born entirely inside the line. Outsiders were baffled by their survival, but the Whitaker men insisted survival itself proved that their doctrine was sacred truth. Their journals revealed chilling confidence. They wrote that nature could be conquered by order, that blood could be refined through cycles, that the line would eventually produce something beyond ordinary human comprehension. Hunting trips became rituals of dominance. Fathers and sons stalked deer not only for meat, but to mimic pursuit of perfection. Each hunt ended with oaths carved into bark, binding sons tighter to doctrine. When neighbors whispered about strange boys with vacant stares or twisted limbs, the Whitakers responded with violence. Outsiders who insulted the bloodline often vanished, their absence explained away by treacherous cliffs or mountain storms. Despite suspicion, the Whitakers thrived. They grew crops, raised cattle, and traded pelts, but rarely with townsfolk. They preferred self-reliance, whispering that trade diluted strength while true wealth came only from blood and obedience. The rotation system turned family into machinery. Fathers became gears, sons became tools, uncles acted as cogs. Each man accepted his place, believing the structure itself carried them toward inevitable, terrible completion. And by mid-century, whispers spread even among the Whitakers that the culmination was near. Generations of design were converging. The bloodline, perfected by the rotation system, was preparing to reveal its final, impossible creation. Samuel Whitaker entered the world already bearing the crushing weight of doctrine. Born under torchlight in a mountain cabin, he was hailed by fathers and uncles as another link in the unbroken line. From his first breath, Samuel was taught that he belonged not to himself, but to the circle. His body, his blood, his future were property of the Whitaker creed, guarded fiercely by patriarchs. Grandfathers drilled him relentlessly. He memorized genealogies before he could sharpen a blade. Uncles tested his endurance in freezing rivers, forcing him to stand until his lips turned blue, demanding proof of strength. Brothers became rivals as much as allies. Every boy fought for approval, knowing that weakness drew punishment. Samuel endured fists, lashes, and silence, learning quickly that mercy had no place in Whitaker life. Despite the brutal upbringing, Samuel showed resilience that impressed the elders. He survived punishments that broke others. He spoke less, observed more, and accepted the doctrine without visible rebellion, earning respect from hard-eyed grandfathers. But beneath his silence, Samuel carried questions. Why must blood only fold inward? Why was the doctrine sacred? He dared not voice doubts, yet deep inside, shadows of unease began to grow. By adolescence, Samuel witnessed the results of the rotation system. Brothers born twisted, cousins who never spoke, nephews whose eyes glowed strangely in moonlight. The elders called these signs of purity, but Samuel saw suffering. One cousin, barely able to walk, was still celebrated as proof of perfection. Samuel's chest tightened watching him stumble across the yard, cheered by fathers who ignored his pain. It planted a seed of dread. The doctrine demanded Samuel's participation. At 16, elders declared him ready. He was ordered to fulfill his role in the cycle, a duty enforced by uncles who stood watch to ensure compliance. Samuel complied outwardly, but each night he stared into the dark rafters, his breath heavy with doubt. The weight of the bloodline pressed on him like chains he couldn't escape. As he matured, strange changes overtook his body. His strength waned despite rigorous training. He grew gaunt, his veins dark beneath the skin, as though the bloodline itself was consuming him from within. Grandfathers interpreted his condition as sacred. They declared Samuel chosen, a vessel prepared for something greater. To him, it felt like poison, as though his body carried not destiny, but a sickness designed by men. Doctors summoned from distant towns examined him once. They left pale-faced, refusing to return, whispering of abnormalities they couldn't classify. The Whitaker men dismissed them as fools, insisting Samuel's suffering meant divine progress. By 17, Samuel felt a pulsing in his body that terrified him. At night, he lay awake, feeling rhythms that weren't his heartbeat, patterns twisting beneath his ribs, as though something else was alive. His uncles grew reverent, whispering that the culmination was near. Brothers began guarding him, treating him less as kin and more as prophecy. Samuel felt trapped, both exalted and imprisoned by expectations he never chose. Each day drained him further. His skin turned pale, his hair thinned, and his eyes shifted in color, taking on a faint glow that unsettled even hardened Whitaker men. Still, they praised him endlessly. Inside, Samuel felt despair. He was breaking apart, consumed by a legacy he hadn't asked to inherit. The doctrine called it purity, but Samuel knew it was something else, a burden disguised as destiny. And as the seasons turned, whispers spread among the Whitaker cabins. Samuel was not merely another son. He was the vessel. His suffering would bring forth the culmination, no matter the cost to him. The night Samuel collapsed, the Whitaker cabins shook with panic. Fathers rushed to carry him down the mountain, uncles clearing paths with torches, brothers lifting his limp frame as though protecting a holy relic. They brought him to the nearest hospital, a small rural building 30 miles away. The arrival stunned the staff. Hardened doctors who had seen countless tragedies immediately sensed this case was unlike anything imaginable. Samuel's body convulsed in waves. Monitors displayed rhythms that made no sense, patterns resembling brain waves more than a heartbeat. Physicians exchanged worried glances while Whitaker men stood proudly, declaring that the culmination was beginning. The labor dragged on for 14 hours. Samuel never regained consciousness, his chest heaving as if carrying a weight beyond human endurance. Grandfathers prayed in low voices, while uncles tightened fists, daring outsiders to interfere. Inside the delivery room, doctors witnessed horrors that broke their composure. Samuel's torso convulsed violently, ribs fracturing under strain, yet somehow he endured. The child inside pulsed with energy, overwhelming the medical instruments recording its presence. One physician swore he heard whispering sounds through the monitors, not mechanical feedback, but tones resembling murmured voices. It chilled him so deeply, he abandoned his station, leaving others to continue the impossible delivery. At dawn, the child finally emerged. Silence fell instantly. Hardened doctors froze, staring at a figure that was alive yet wrong. Whitaker men leaned forward eagerly, their faces lit with awe rather than fear. The child's head was grotesquely enlarged, its skin translucent, revealing a brain that pulsed like many organs stitched together. Instead of normal folds, separate clusters moved independently, glowing faintly under the harsh surgical lamps. Its arms jutted from twisted angles, ending in hands with too many fingers spiraled unnaturally. Its legs coiled together like vines, and where feet should have been, small, malformed faces blinked and mouthed soundless words. Most disturbing was the child's main face, or rather faces. 3 overlapping visages shared one skull, shifting constantly, frozen in an expression that resembled silent screaming. Doctors whispered prayers, unable to comprehend what they saw. The child breathed, its eyes moved. It lived. For the Whitaker men, this was triumph. They called it the perfect one, the culmination of generations of blood. For the doctors, it was an abomination beyond medicine. Brothers pressed their hands against the glass of the incubator, whispering chants taught since childhood. Uncles brought carved stones from the mountains, arranging them around Samuel's bed. They saw sacred victory where outsiders saw tragedy. The child never cried. Instead, it produced strange humming sounds, almost like static, vibrating through the room. Grandfathers insisted these tones were speech in the old language of the Whitakers, a sign of chosen lineage. Doctors debated whether to keep it alive. Ethically, they were torn between duty and horror, yet their curiosity overruled hesitation. They maintained the child, documenting every irregularity while Whitaker men rejoiced at each breath. Samuel remained unconscious, his body drained. His chest rose faintly, but his eyes never opened again. Fathers stroked his hair, whispering oaths that his suffering had not been in vain. The child had been born. For 6 days, the impossible infant survived. During that time, the hospital became a fortress, surrounded by grim Whitaker men. Outsiders dared not enter. Every hallway echoed with the low voices of determined brothers. Each passing day revealed stranger phenomena. The child's many eyes moved independently, following separate objects at once. Its body rearranged itself into positions doctors swore were geometrically impossible. Yet Whitaker men only smiled, calling it destiny. By the 6th day, Samuel lay still, his breath shallow. Beside him, the child coiled into a perfect spiral, forming a pattern no doctor recognized. With a final humming sigh, it died, smiling eerily. The impossible child survived against every medical prediction. Doctors expected death within hours, yet its chest rose steadily. Whitaker men gathered around the incubator, their expressions reverent, treating each breath as proof of prophecy fulfilled. On the first day, the child produced vibrations resembling low humming. The sound unsettled doctors, but grandfathers insisted it was sacred speech. Brothers leaned close, nodding solemnly, whispering that the voice carried messages from ancestors. The second day revealed more strangeness. Its eyes moved independently, tracking multiple objects simultaneously. Doctors recoiled, yet Whitaker men smiled, declaring that vision beyond normal limits confirmed the bloodline's path toward evolutionary transcendence. By the 3rd day, the child demonstrated recognition. When uncles spoke in their mountain dialect, its many eyes focused. When strangers approached, its faces twisted in agitation. Blood, it seemed, was the only language it understood. On the 4th day, the child's body rearranged unnaturally. Its twisted limbs bent into forms defying anatomy, arranging into patterns resembling ancient spirals. Whitaker men interpreted this as sacred geometry, evidence of divine design within flesh. The 5th day brought decay, patches of its skin darkened, organs failing beneath transparent layers. Doctors panicked, but the Whitakers rejoiced, calling the transformation holy shedding, insisting the body was preparing for its final revelation. Samuel remained near death, his chest faintly rising. Brothers kept vigil at his side, whispering oaths of loyalty. They believed his suffering had opened the path for the culmination, his body a vessel for destiny. During these days, outsiders were barred from entry. Armed Whitaker men filled the hospital hallways, standing guard with rifles and axes. Doctors who resisted were silenced with stares that carried both menace and certainty. The child never cried. Its sound remained that eerie, static hum, echoing faintly in corridors. Staff swore it resonated through walls, vibrating like distant thunder. Whitaker men insisted it was the language of pure blood. On the 6th day, something extraordinary occurred. In the dim light, the child bent into a perfect spiral, its twisted limbs aligning into a pattern no human body should form. Doctors gasped in disbelief. The pattern resembled carved symbols found in Whitaker caves. Grandfathers recognized it instantly, claiming it fulfilled prophecies whispered through generations. To them, the child had become living scripture, proof their doctrine had achieved completion. With that transformation complete, its faces relaxed. The twisted expressions of agony softened, and for the first time, it seemed to smile. Doctors froze, shaken, while Whitaker men fell to their knees in awe. Moments later, its chest stilled. The humming ceased. The impossible child was gone. Silence filled the room, broken only by the heavy breathing of men who realized they had witnessed something that defied science entirely. Doctors felt relief, even grief. Yet Whitaker men wept with pride. They saw no death, only ascension. For them, 6 days of survival was proof their generations of sacrifice had not been wasted. Samuel died 3 days later. His chest collapsed quietly as brothers held his hands. Grandfathers whispered prayers over him, praising his endurance, declaring he had carried the burden of generations to sacred completion. Federal agents arrived within hours. They seized the body, the records, and even Whitaker relics brought from the mountains. They labeled it a genetic hazard, but the men knew it was much more. Every witness signed papers swearing silence, yet the Whitakers needed no reminders. They retreated into the mountains once more, carrying their secret, their pride, and their belief that 6 days of life had changed everything. The story of the impossible child became legend whispered in shadows. Outsiders heard only fragments, but among Whitaker men, the tale lived on. Proof that blood, purity, and doctrine had touched something beyond humanity. The morning after the impossible child's death, black cars rolled into the hospital grounds. Men in suits stepped out, carrying briefcases and equipment unfamiliar to local staff. Their presence silenced even the sternest Whitaker brothers. They identified themselves as federal officials, though no credentials were offered. Doctors protested, but the men moved swiftly, confiscating charts, photographs, and even the incubator. They treated the case as contamination, not history. Grandfathers bristled, but uncles restrained them. To challenge armed federal agents would mean bloodshed. Instead, Whitaker men stood silently, watching strangers carry away what they believed was sacred proof of their lineage's culmination. Samuel's body was seized as well. His chest had stilled 3 days earlier, yet to the Whitakers, his remains were holy. Agents loaded him into a van, ignoring brothers who begged for return. The death certificate listed multiple congenital anomalies. Doctors knew the truth was far darker, but their voices were bound by secrecy agreements. The Whitaker men saw the bland language as deliberate erasure of destiny. Agents swept through the hospital like a storm. They collected every relic the Whitakers had brought: carved stones, genealogical ledgers, and even sharpened tools. Nothing connected to the bloodline was left behind. One physician later admitted that the agents carried devices unlike anything he had seen. They scanned walls, floors, even Samuel's bed, as though searching for traces invisible to human eyes. The sight chilled witnesses. Whitaker men were interrogated in windowless rooms. Federal voices asked about breeding practices, genealogical patterns, and rituals. Brothers gave nothing. They spoke only of loyalty, refusing to betray secrets carved into their bones. After hours of questioning, the men were released. Agents threatened imprisonment if a single word leaked. Yet Whitaker brothers needed no warning. Silence had been their weapon for generations. They would not break. When townsfolk gathered days later, the hospital seemed unchanged, but its corridors carried an eerie emptiness. Staff avoided questions, while rumors spread of whispered chants, strange lights, and the impossible child locked in federal vaults. Meanwhile, the Whitakers vanished. Cabins once filled with smoke lay dark, tools abandoned, fences left unpatched. Outsiders who braved the ridges found nothing but footprints leading deeper into the mist-covered mountains. Neighbors claimed they still heard them. On certain nights, low chanting carried on the wind, masculine voices murmuring old oaths. Hunters reported torchlight flickering among trees, but no outsider ever reached the source. Sheriffs mounted small expeditions. Each time, the search ended abruptly. Deputies returned shaken, claiming they saw shadows of men standing silently in the woods, watching from distances too far to chase. The Whitakers became ghosts in their own land. Roads crumbled, cabins rotted, but their presence lingered. Outsiders avoided the valleys, warning travelers that the mountains carried secrets better left untouched. Decades passed. The government never admitted involvement. Records remained sealed, files stamped classified. But among federal halls, whispers persisted of the Whitaker incident, a case so disturbing it defied scientific and ethical frameworks. Grandsons of those first agents later admitted their elders never recovered. Some drank heavily, others resigned early. One confessed on his deathbed that he dreamed nightly of the child's spiraled body smiling in silence. For the Whitakers, disappearance was victory. Their doctrine remained hidden, their secrets intact. They believed federal theft could not erase their accomplishment. The pure line had reached its culmination, and that truth could never be destroyed. And so, while the world forgot, the Whitakers endured, unseen, unheard, waiting in the mountains where blood, silence, and loyalty ruled. They had vanished, but their disappearance only deepened the legend of the pure line. 50 years after Samuel's burden ended, sealed government files were quietly declassified. Almost no one noticed, but inside those pages lay a record of obsession, secrecy, and bloodlines twisted deliberately across generations of Whitaker men. The files describe genealogies resembling blueprints. Each union, every birth, all documented with cold precision. Analysts admitted the rotation system wasn't random. It followed patterns too deliberate, as though designed for a purpose beyond mere superstition. One chilling line in the report declared, "The Whitaker case suggests intentional genetic experimentation spanning generations." The suggestion unsettled officials, hinting that these mountain men had pursued goals resembling science rather than isolated madness. Researchers examining DNA samples decades later were stunned. The Whitaker blood contained sequences that appeared unnatural, fragments arranged in ways suggesting manipulation. Some scientists wondered if such design could have been guided, not accidental. But the question remained unanswered. Who guided it? Was it the grandfathers themselves, refining doctrine with obsessive precision? Or had outside forces nudged them, using their isolation as a laboratory hidden from civilization? Federal agents never pursued further. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, whispers claimed men in Washington feared uncovering more families like the Whitakers, lineages perfected through secrecy, waiting quietly in forgotten valleys. Meanwhile, Appalachian locals swore the Whitakers had never left. Hunters reported distant chanting, fires glowing faintly across ridges. No one dared investigate. To enter those hollers was to risk becoming another missing traveler. For the Whitakers themselves, the culmination was legend. Fathers told sons of Samuel's suffering, uncles recited the 6 days of life, grandfathers reminded boys that their blood had touched the impossible and carried it briefly. The doctrine survived in fragments carved into wood, etched into stone, and whispered in cabins abandoned to outsiders. Each oath reinforced that the Whitakers were chosen, their blood destined to achieve perfection again. Some modern genealogists traced men in rural counties with peculiar features, eyes strangely pale, jaws repeating the same structure. Whispers suggested Whitaker descendants had scattered, blending while still protecting fragments of the pure line. Official denials did little to quiet speculation. Reporters who attempted to revisit the story found doors closed, witnesses silent. Some swore that former doctors vanished mysteriously, as though voices connected to the child were erased. Legends grew darker. Locals claimed to see Whitaker brothers walking silently along ridges under the moon, carrying torches carved with spiral symbols. No one approached. Fear of their presence kept entire valleys deserted. Within Appalachian folklore, the Whitakers became myth. Fathers frightened sons with tales of mountain men guarding secrets older than the towns themselves. Yet historians knew fragments of truth were buried beneath those ghost stories. The declassified files ended abruptly, with a final paragraph hinting at broader programs. Further investigation recommended to determine if similar cases exist. Yet no investigation followed. Silence replaced action, leaving questions rotting in archives. For the Whitakers, silence had always been strength. They vanished deliberately, ensuring outsiders could never comprehend their doctrine. Their greatest weapon wasn't violence, but absence, leaving only echoes to fuel curiosity and dread. To this day, hikers speak of strange spirals etched into trees, stone cairns arranged in impossible shapes, and distant voices chanting oaths in forgotten dialects. Signs that the bloodline's presence endures, unseen but unbroken. The story of Samuel and the impossible child ends here, yet the legacy of the pure line lingers. Somewhere in those mountains, men still guard their blood, convinced destiny waits for another culmination. And if history dares repeat itself, the world may once again confront the impossible, a creation born not of love, but of doctrine, crafted by fathers, brothers, uncles, and grandfathers sworn to the line.